I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm Will Iserman, and I am the Associate Director of the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management, known as NCHAM, at Utah State University, and also the co-director of the EHDI NTRC, or National Technical Resource Center, which is in existence with funding by HRSA to support the implementation of the EHDI system throughout the United States. And as a part of those activities, one of the things that we offer are these periodic webinars on topics of interest. This webinar is being recorded. So if anything disrupts your full participation in today's webinar, or if you think of individuals who you think might benefit from today's webinar, but whom are not attending live, you can direct them to our website in the next couple of days, and you'll be able to stream this at any time that you'd like. And that website is infanthearing.org. And we encourage you to go to infanthearing.org to look at a wide range of resources in addition to all of our recorded webinars. We're delighted to have our presenters with us today from Columbia University, and I'll allow them to each introduce themselves to you. Once they have wrapped up their comments today, we'll be opening up a Q&A field and inviting you to ask whatever questions or comments that you would like our presenters to respond to. Hold your questions until you're invited to do that. We're not going to be monitoring questions while they are presenting. And maybe your question will be answered as a part of their prepared remarks. A shout out to our interpreter and hopefully to our captioner who will be joining us shortly for your assistance in helping us provide the most accessible learning opportunities possible. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome our presenters, Drs. Elaine Smolen and Bryn Powell from Columbia University.
Thank you so much, Will. I'm Elaine Smolen, and I am here with our program director, Maria Hartman. We also had tremendous support on this project from Bryn Powell, who is one of our advanced doctoral students. So we are excited to share with you some of our research and some of the information that we know about getting ready to be readers pre-literacy during the EHDI period. Both Maria and I are faculty members in the Deaf and Hard of Hearing education program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Here are disclosures. We will be talking about one of the tools that we have helped co-develop today, but we don't receive any royalties or compensation from its sale. And I'm hard of hearing and use hearing aids. Okay, so here's what we're planning to cover this afternoon. We're going to be talking about theories and research on what sometimes is called the science of reading. We'll get into what that means and how that applies to the EHDI period. We'll be talking about what we call stage 0 in learning to read, which is the pre-reading period. We'll be learning about tools that you can use to track and target those pre-reading skills that we're going to cover. And then throughout all of this, as deaf educators, we can't help infuse all of the information that we know about reading development for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So we'll be specifically talking about these stages which cover pre-reading development for all children, but we'll be talking about the special considerations, special tools, and special things that we need to think about as professionals and parents and other people who work in the field when we're thinking about our infants and toddlers and young children who are deaf or hard of hearing.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, my good colleague here at Teachers College. Today, I will be talking a lot about the foundations of reading in typically hearing children, and then how what we know about that development can be applied to our students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Everything that we talk about today is something that you can learn more about through these two websites. One is Reading Rockets, and the other is Colorín Colorado, which is the Spanish version of Reading Rockets. Both of these websites are federally funded literacy initiatives, and they offer lots of good information and resources for anyone who works with young readers. So you might be a parent or a caregiver, you might be an early interventionist or an SLP, you might be a teacher. Any one of us who work with children who are young and preparing to become readers would benefit from taking a look at these sites and the resources they use. We like these sites because they're research-based and there's evidence to show that the skills and strategies they present are valid. Okay, so they're not about deaf and hard of hearing children specifically, but they are grounded in the same science and the idea that deaf and hard of hearing children need to learn the same things about reading that typically hearing children do. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, and let's just start all together thinking about what we know as parents or as teachers or as caregivers, as early interventionists or SLPs. What do we know about typical reading development? Why is it important? And then what does that mean for the children that we work with? So to help us start thinking about what we know, let's take a look at the first question. Okay? Often in early reading programs, there'll be a section on reading nonsense words. So words like flep and tridding and pertolic, which are not words, right? But why is it useful to know if a student can read those words? Why would a teacher or an interventionist want to know that a young reader could read those words, right? And then number two, what does it mean if a 5-year-old child writes, "Please take me, yet you"? And you can see how those are written on the slide, and then the translation, "Please take me with you," in the parentheses. So you might be thinking that what these two instances help us know is that the child who can read nonsense words and the child who can write a sentence like that are children who are aware of the phoneme system in English. So
Can I interrupt you for just one moment? I just want to let everyone know that the closed captioning option is now available on your screen. You just need to click the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen to enable them. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. All right. So a skilled reader, as I was saying, can easily pronounce those words, even though they're not words, and still have cognitive room to make meaning from what they're reading. A less skilled reader has a harder time sounding out those words. A student who can write, "Please take me with you," is showing that they are at the early phonetic or the sound spelling stage. And both of these students show a fairly well-developed awareness of speech sounds, right? Maybe not so much of standard spelling yet, but that will come with instruction. So a big part of early reading is knowing about letters and sounds, and then knowing how those letters and sounds sound like speech when we read? And then finally, which words do good readers skip as they read along at a good pace? So this is a fluency question, and I would have answered it incorrectly in the beginning of my work in reading. But now I can say that science shows us that good readers skip almost no words, because at faster than lightning speed, our brains process every letter of almost every word as we read. So we can't skip words and get the same meaning that we would if we read them all. Now, as I mentioned before, deaf and hard of hearing readers need to learn the same things that hearing readers learn. They might need more time, and they might need more support, and they might need different scaffolds, but they need to learn the same things. And we'll go into that here in our next number of slides. What I often tell the students that I work with is the more you know about reading and how it develops, the more you're able to help the children that you work with. So in order to develop our common understanding here, we're going to look at something called the simple view of reading, developed by Goff and Tunmer in 1986, and then revised a little bit more a few years later by Hoover and Goff. And according to the simple view of reading, people need two things in order to gain meaning from what they read. They need to be able to decode, and they need to know the language of the print that they're reading. So if we're reading English, we need to know the English language. Now, at the time, in the 1980s, the whole language movement was very popular, and some scientists wanted to remind those of us who teach reading that the role of decoding is really important, that whole word reading is typically not how the brain learns to read, that we need to be able to decode or sound out words. And they proposed this simple view of reading as a mathematical formula with 3 variables, right? And if we know 2 of the variables, if we know how well a child can decode and know that they have the language of the print that they're reading, they can attain reading comprehension. Okay? If they have decoding skills, but maybe they don't know a lot of the language that they're reading, their reading comprehension will suffer. So you see that middle line, word recognition, decoding, but not much language, does not result in reading comprehension. And then the final line, if you don't know how to decode, even if you do know language, it still will not result in reading comprehension. Because reading is about taking the symbols on the page and turning them into speech or turning them into language. So to help us understand this formula even more, let's look at some simple children's text. So I'm going to demonstrate how I am that first line on the simple view of reading. I have word recognition, I have language comprehension, so I can understand what I read. And I'm sure will be the same for you here. In March, the wind blows down the door and spills my soup upon the floor. It laps it up and roars for more. Blowing once, blowing twice, blowing chicken soup with rice. So because I can decode and because I know the language of print, I can read fluently at a good pace. I can impose intonation and prosody into what I'm reading, and therefore I have reading comprehension. Let's think about the second line of that mathematical formula. So this page is written in German, and I don't know German. But because it's a phonetic language, I can sort of decode, right? I can say the words vom kleinen Malwurf, der weißen Wolt, and I'll stop there. So I can pronounce those words, but because I don't know German, I don't have language comprehension in that language. So this results in my not having reading comprehension for this page. Okay, so I can pronounce, I can decode, but I don't have language comprehension, so I don't understand. And then the third scenario, I have neither decoding skills or language comprehension. This is Russian, and Russian has a different alphabetic system and clearly a different language. I can neither pronounce these words or understand what they say. So I do not have any reading comprehension of this selection. So when we think about our deaf students, we think about how many sounds they can hear and how they can use those sounds to make connections to print. And we know that often our students are not hearing all the sounds. So we know immediately that decoding will be something they need more support with. We also know that because deaf and hard of hearing children may hear less sound, even through their devices, they may have less access to what fluent language sounds like. So they may have less language comprehension or less of an understanding of the language they are expected to read. So their reading comprehension suffers. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the simple view of reading. And now let's go back and look at what this means in terms of brain functioning. So you probably remember from your college courses or maybe just from your wide reading that language is innate, that human beings are born to be social, and learning to communicate with each other is something that humans seem predisposed for. There are actually parts of the brain that we know are the language areas, right? And we know this because when someone has a stroke, these areas of the brain no longer function the way they did before. So we know there are specific areas that are devoted to language production and language understanding, but there are no areas of the brain that are devoted to reading on its own. Okay, reading is a new ability in human history. It's fairly recent. So our brains have not yet had time to specify genes or areas that are connected to reading. So to successfully read and write, the brain has to take other parts that were maybe designed for something else and make connections so that those brains can learn to read. So we'll take a look now at our next slide, and we can see that those little green areas at the back of the brain become involved with the speech areas during reading. So the language areas are those yellow areas, and then to become a reader, the brain has to engage some of the visual areas, right? We have to look at the print, and the print has to activate the language areas of the brain, those yellow areas. Now, many children learn to read by themselves. They learn to read through rich experiences with books and with caregivers who read to them. Many readers learn to infer the rules of reading, but most children don't. Most children require structured literacy teaching. And we'll talk more about that later, but just so you have an idea of what's going on in the brain. To elaborate a little further, we'll take a look at this brain over a period of time that is showing what happens in the brain when someone speaks. Okay, and we have this information through neuroscience and neuroimaging. We can see the parts of the brain that are activated when someone speaks. So if you look on the left at 55 milliseconds, when someone speaks, activity starts in that small spot that's roughly in the middle of the left side of the brain. But then in less than a second, right, at 170 milliseconds and 250 milliseconds, that activation spreads downward and forward until a big chunk of the left side is activated or lights up. So the part of the brain that is lit up here is the part of the brain that deals with speech. Notice that the back of the brain is dark. It isn't activated at all. So the back part of the brain is not involved in speech. Let's see on the next slide what it is involved in. Okay, so this time we're looking at the brain of someone who is reading a word. Okay, at 55 milliseconds, where does activity begin? Not in the middle, as we saw in the last slide for someone who's speaking, but in the back of the brain, which is the visual area. So even though that little red spot seems far away from your eyes, that's where visual signals are sent. And if this were the brain of someone who could not read, that signal would stop right there because the person wouldn't recognize letters as something that's related to language. Okay, but this is the brain of a reader, so the signal does not end in the back of the brain. What happens to it? Okay, we can go to the next slide. So instead of stopping, we see activity spreading from the back of the brain along the bottom surface and into the whole middle area, which is the area that's responsible for speech. So what we're seeing here is the written word triggering speech. And this happens whether you actually read out loud or not. The same circuit is involved in articulating a word or just recognizing it once you've become a reader. Ken Pugh says, in reading, the visual area of the brain integrates with the speech area. Okay, so So between these two zones, the visual zone at the back of the brain and the spoken language zone in the middle of the brain become connected. So in a sense, if you have learned to read, you have built that area of your brain. And we're going to call that visual area the brain's letterbox. Okay, and you saw the little GIF of how that activation moves forward in the brain of a reader. Okay, so these are things that happen in the brain. There's this homemade part of the brain that's really flexible once it's built, right? You can read different types of fonts. You can read different size letters. You can read sentences that are all connected together. You can read sentences where capitals and lowercase letters are mixed up, right? Your brain can handle all those print variations automatically. But you still have to learn what the words say. So if you look at the second column on the slide, you have to learn that the first letter up at the top is called P. And that P usually makes the sound, the first sound in the word pen. It doesn't matter what the P looks like. It can be a lowercase p or a script P or a P that's filled in. It still says P as in pen. Okay, so that part you had to learn. And there are lots of other things that kids need to learn too when they're becoming readers of English. And that's on the next slide. English is a morphophonemic language, meaning words are made of letters that have individual sounds, right? They have the phonemes, and words are made of groups of letters that change sound depending on their grouping. So all of this is what children need to learn. In English, when you see a word beginning with P, it could represent the P sound. But it could also represent the F sound, as in photo. Or it could be silent, as in pterodactyl. I'll give the interpreter a minute to get through that. Right? In Spanish, the symbol P always stands for the P sound. In words like pastel, meaning cake, or words like por, P-O-R, meaning for, P always makes the P sound, but not in English, right? In English, we have words that have the PH, like alphabet, and dolphin, and nephew. And why do we have those words? Because in English, lots of words are borrowed from other languages. And the PH sound is borrowed from the Greek. So kids have to learn that P doesn't always make the P sound. Look at the letter E in the middle column. There are at least 6 possibilities for how to sound out E. It can sound like E as in end, or E, the long E as in eat. It can sound like I as in your eyeball. It can sound like as in early, and it can sound like A as in 8. So English readers have to learn a lot, not only about individual sounds, but about specific patterns of sounds. Okay, we have words like health, words like health, which has 4 sounds in it, right? Looks like it should be pronounced health, but it's health because of the root word heal. Interesting. Okay, so all of this has to be learned. Maybe you've seen this Nancy Young graphic. She notes that very few children up there in the green section learn to read seemingly without effort. But all of those other children need instruction. And a good rule of thumb is the more challenges a child has, the more structured their needs, their instruction needs to become. Okay, I'll do these last 2 slides and then Elaine will take over. In the early 2000s, the work of the National Reading Panel helped us know that there were 5 important areas for reading instruction. These were 5 areas that most children need direct instruction of them. In terms of the EHDI period, phonological awareness develops for years before children are expected to look at print on a page. So we know that typically hearing children listen to language for years before they go to school and then start looking at the relationship between letters and phonemes in phonics instruction. Okay, reading fluency, being able to read accurately and quickly depends on your knowledge of phonological awareness and your decoding ability. And then, of course, the more words you know, the more you know about how to pronounce those words, the easier comprehension will be. So even though you may work with children during the EHDI period, those children are starting to learn to read even before any of us know it by developing these skills. Another way to think about this is through Scarborough's reading rope. And Hollis Scarborough developed this rope, or the metaphor of the rope, in order to show how all of language comprehension is basically intertwined with kids' word recognition skills. So all of that language comprehension that goes on in the years before children enter formal schooling is then used later on to make word recognition easier. So a strong relationship between those two, the language comprehension and the word recognition, as we noted in the simple view also. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it over to Elaine.
All right. So we want to give you we wanted to give you a very in-depth overview of the theories of reading development, not because, as Maria mentioned, we think most of you are working with children who are in the learning to read stage, but because we want to set the stage for what children need to do once they get into school. And as we hope we've shown you, the process of learning to read is very complex. Even despite the name, Simple View of Reading, you need to have a lot of skills in your language comprehension and a lot of skills in your decoding abilities before you can wrap that up into reading comprehension. And so for those of us who work with children who are infants and toddlers, there are a lot of things that we can do with them, a lot of skills that we should be looking out for that we call pre-reading. And we base our work on Jean Chall's stages of reading development that she developed in the 80s. These stages don't necessarily have ages attached to them, but her theory shows that reading skills build upon each other through stages that all children need to pass through. And the first one is pre-reading. These are the skills that children attain before they even enter school. All of those language comprehension, all those phonological awareness skills that Maria was talking about. We're going to talk more in depth about that. But what's important to know about this graphic and about the stages is that stages don't end. There's not a discrete end. The pre-reading stage, which begins in infancy, continues on. The skills that children attain then continue on as they start to read, as they get more and more fluent, as they start reading to learn, if you've heard that phrase, all the way up until stage 5, when they are very adept, advanced college-level readers. Okay, so what we want to focus on for the rest of the presentation is this pre-reading stage. This is where we'll find most of our children in what we call the EHDI period, in birth through age 5, let's say. In this period, children are doing a lot of learning through communication, through interaction with toys, through their work of play, right? Children during this period are developing language skills, so they're getting that language comprehension piece that they're going to need later to map onto print. They're becoming aware of the phoneme system of the language that they're going to be learning to read. As Maria mentioned, when we think about our children who are deaf or hard of hearing, particularly those who are learning to listen and talk with hearing technology, there are a lot of things we need to be aware of in terms of challenges that children might have with specific phonemes, in terms of making sure that all of the phonemes are accessible to that child, not just for communication purposes, but because that's setting the stage for their phonological awareness and decoding skills later on. Children are also getting really familiar with books, even though they're not reading the words on the page, right? They're getting simple concepts of reading, looking at the front of a book, opening, turning pages, getting experience using writing tools like crayons. And they might even start to pseudo-read or pretend read, open up a book and read it to a stuffed animal or to a younger sibling, not actually decoding the words on the page, but starting to gain understanding that when you open a book and you see text, that text has meaning, that in a skilled reader turns from squiggles and lines on the page into language. So by age 4 and 5, after all of this work of early childhood, all of this work of play, some children can point to different words or pictures when they're asked. Some can recite the alphabet. Some can recognize written letters or maybe even write their own name. But most importantly, generally, children can understand thousands of words that they can hear or see, but can read very few of them. So they've done all that work of language comprehension before they enter formal schooling and are expected to start taking the words on the page and connecting them with that language. So what do we do with children during this period in stage 0? The good news is a lot of the work that parents and professionals, whether it be teachers of the deaf, early interventionists, SLPs, maybe even audiologists and other educators are doing is pre-reading work. So this is our biggest message to you, that even if you are not working with children who are in elementary school or doing formal reading instruction, most of the good strategies that we're doing with children to help them access language are working on reading. We are developing readers when those children are 1 month old or 3 years old or 4.5 years old. All of this work that we do, playing on the floor, singing songs, reading stories together, playing with toys, going and having experiences that child now builds into their background knowledge, are all building a reader. So in stage 0, there's very little that we're doing to call specific attention to print, but we are interacting linguistically. That's building their language and background knowledge. The baby games that we play, peekaboo, hide and seek, doing different nursery rhymes, all of those build fluency. All of them build turn-taking skills. All of them build language skills. We love to sing songs, and one of our favorite recording artists is Ella Jenkins. So if you haven't had a chance to check out her work, we really highly encourage you to do that. She has great songs like Who Fed the Chickens, which we don't have time to play, but you can seek out. And what's wonderful about her folk songs is that they are call and response. And what happens there is that she or an adult sings a line and children repeat it. So what are we doing there that has to do with reading? Well, we're building fluency. When a child has to repeat saying something with the same intonation, the same prosody, the same speed as an adult, you're building oral fluency. You're learning to put those sounds together in a way that sounds like words and language. And then later on, you're going to be able to take the words on the page and put them together, as Maria said, accurately, quickly, and with expression in a way that sounds like language. So that oral fluency that you build from singing songs, learning poems, engaging in chants, helps to build your reading fluency later. And that reading fluency is going to be really key for building comprehension. We can also, yes.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to point out, I forgot to say this before, that anything that is underlined in the slides is a link to something that will explain it further or be the example. So when you download the PDF of the slides, the links should work for you.
Yes, and I'm not sure if those slides are available widely, but we have our contact info at the end, and we're very happy to share a PDF of the slides. Yes, thank you. We, as Maria probably alluded to, and as you can see, we could go on for days and days about this topic. We don't have time in a whole just a 1 hour webinar, but we want to be sure to share all the resources. So thank you, Maria. So a lot of these activities, using wordless picture books to make up your own story, storytelling with puppets and taking on the roles of different characters, singing songs that involve different words or different rhymes or different sounds. All of those things are great language activities that I think many of us are doing. But there's a new way of thinking about it when we decide that these things are actually working on reading as well. We are building readers by singing songs, by engaging in poetry, by doing storytelling with puppets, in addition to all of the other wonderful cognitive and linguistic things that we're working on. Okay, so we know this theoretically, and we think that a lot of this information can be applied to children who are deaf or hard of hearing, but we don't have a lot of recent research to show us how children who are deaf or hard of hearing are learning to read right now. The science of reading is a really hot topic in the general education world. You've probably seen a lot of press about, controversies around the term, about what people are doing in the general education setting. But in our field, we think that we can apply these evidence-based principles to reading instruction for deaf and hard of hearing kids, but we don't have a lot of knowledge about what kids are doing now. We have some research from the past that has shown that children with deaf or hard of who are deaf or hard of hearing have really struggled to learn how to read, sometimes graduating high school with an average 4th grade reading level. But we in the field know anecdotally and clinically that many children are surpassing that. And we think that some of these successes that children are having are due to the simple view of reading. If you think about children's access to sound through technology, right? They might have better access to the phoneme system, which then leads to better word recognition. We also see children through the work of NCHAM and others being identified with as deaf or hard of hearing at birth or very, very early and having access to technology and intervention, which then we see in the literature leads to better language outcomes. So if you have stronger pre-decoding skills and stronger language outcomes, that should lead to better reading. So what some of our work here at Teachers College has been to investigate just that, to see what children are doing now with very good early intervention and good use of technology for those whose families are choosing to learn listening and spoken language. So we'll tell you just a little bit about our Read Up study, and then I want to get into a couple of tools that you can use. Our Read Up study looked at 150 or so children in pre-K through 5th grade, and we've been following these children for now 4 years, and we're looking at different areas of reading development and spelling and word attack and reading comprehension, fluency, and vocabulary. When we started this study before COVID, we found that the participants in our study had, on average, scores within the average range in all of those subtests, which means that contrary to what we saw historically, these children who had had strong early intervention and strong auditory-based learning in their classrooms were performing in the average range. They had strong decoding skills and they had strong language comprehension. One of the things that we found that was interesting, though, was that many of these children, if they had a challenge, it was in reading fluency. And we mentioned that reading fluency, which is reading accurately, quickly, and with expression, is really important as a bridge to decoding through those sounds to get to comprehension. If you can decode really quickly and accurately and start to make those sounds into words and into sentences that sound like language, that have meaning, that aids your comprehension. So this reading fluency piece, we think, is really key, and that's something that we're looking at further. We also looked at some of our children in that very early period when we think about the EHDI period. We looked at our cohorts of children from pre-K from before COVID and those after, when we returned after, COVID had started. And we were hoping that we wouldn't find a big difference in the performance of those children, but we knew that there had been interruptions in their schooling and their intervention. We don't need to tell you what that looked like during COVID. But fortunately, we did not find any learning loss within this cohort of children. So now we're investigating further to see what kind of instruction was happening, even if it was remote, even if it was in the home. And what we think is that the strong focus that our field has on coaching parents and on family-centered intervention really helped these kids continue to make pre-reading and reading progress, even if they weren't attending school each day. Now, I want to skip ahead just a second because I want to be able to show you this, and then we'll pause for some questions. So our work with Sunshine Cottage School for Deaf Children originally started with research. We wanted to be able to document what children were achieving now in the new landscape of deaf and hard of hearing education. But we also wanted to work together to build something that would be useful to practitioners, both those who worked at that school and, more importantly, the itinerant teachers and SLPs and early interventionists who often are working kind of on our own with children in neighborhoods and districts all across the country. And then, most importantly, we wanted to provide something that would be useful to parents. So Sunshine Cottage approached us about co-developing what we call the reading castles. This is based upon or inspired by Sunshine Cottage's other tool, which is called the Cottage Acquisition Scales for Listening, Language, and Speech. Sorry, I went too fast. So this is inspired by the Cottage Acquisition Scales for Listening, Language, and Speech, which we call the castles. So the reading castles is inspired by that tool, which tracks language and listening. This tool is designed to be able to track reading progress and pre-reading progress from birth all the way through third grade. And what we wanted to be able to do here was not to do anything necessarily revolutionary in terms of thinking about those pre-reading skills. We already know what they are through many, many years of research and all of the theories that we've shared. But what we wanted to be able to do was provide a tool that would track each of these behaviors in a way that was clear for practitioners and then, more importantly, for parents. This is something that we have seen being used out in the field, and we hope will continue to be used to show parents that all of the work that they're doing when they're playing with their child, when they're reading with their child, when they are out and about and trying to experience the world, when they're infusing language through their everyday activities, is working on language and literacy, so that those children are learning to read, even these itty-bitty children in the 0 to 12-month period. So the reading castles provides a way to track reading progress across all these different domains on the top, from birth in the early literacy period, all the way up through those concrete skills that children need to learn in kindergarten through third grade. We have, if you request the slides, we have a couple of videos that you can use to kind of look at what some of these behaviors look like. But I think think in the interest of time, I think it would be best to just skip ahead to our contact information and give you a chance to ask questions. We've covered a lot of material here, and we obviously have a lot more that we'd be happy to talk about at a different time. But we hope what we've left you with is a solid foundation in what reading looks like for typically developing children, some of the challenges that our deaf and hard of hearing children might have, and then some of the tools and things to think about when you're working with children who aren't even reading yet, but are learning to read. Thank you.
This is Will Iserman from NCHAM, and I want to invite you to use the Q&A field now to ask some questions, and we have a few already. I want to just let you all know that when we're done with today's presentation, you'll have an opportunity to give us a little feedback and also to generate a certificate of attendance for today. So before you sign off, be sure to get that link that will appear at the top of the hour in the chat box. So our first question, is this about children with, or what about children without access to sound?
Okay, Elaine, I can start and then you can jump in if you like.
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm just reading ahead in the questions and noting that there are a number of questions that deal with children who are signing and who maybe do not have as much access to sound. So what we are projecting here in this slide deck and through the research we've looked at and the research we've done ourselves, the idea that English is a language that is sound-based is important, right? So we believe and we've witnessed deaf children who use their technology who can become familiar with the phoneme system through the use of their technology and possibly through the use of other visual means like cued speech and visual phonics. So we are saying that if you can't hear the language you're expected to read, learning to read it will be harder. And it might take more time to develop those skills. But they can be developed auditorily and or visually through representations of the phoneme system like cued speech or visual phonics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, something to note, just as Maria showed the model of the, percentage of children who will learn to read just by incidental learning and then those who need additional instruction, there are always exceptions to the rule, right? So we all know deaf children who have no access to sound who learn to read beautifully and seemingly very effortlessly. A lot of that is due to really strong language foundations. But what we know from the research in general education and then also in our population is that learning to read will be much easier if you have some access to the phoneme system, as Maria said, either auditorily or visually or both.
So the next question, this is Will again, is the Reading Castle specifically for administration to deaf and hard of hearing populations?
Yeah, so the Reading Castles was developed with our population in mind, but what it does is document the skills that all readers, specifically those who are using listening and spoken language, it could be hearing readers or it could be deaf readers, need to learn in order to progress through the stages. So this is based on general reading research, and so it can be used with children who are deaf or hard of hearing. It can be used with other children who are receiving early intervention. It can be used with typically developing children to track their progress. So we created it with deaf and hard of hearing children in mind. The manual is written with deaf and hard of hearing children in mind because that's our population. But there's nothing about it that would preclude you from using it with other children. We just think for our population, it's really important for us to keep in mind all the language pieces. And you can use the castles for that or many of the other tools that are available, but also to specifically track reading and writing development even before reading and writing starts to happen in school.
We have just a few minutes left. This next comment includes a question and a comment for you to respond to, and it starts with a thank you for your work. And the comment reads, the view that deaf or hard of hearing children need to learn the exact same processes that hearing children use may be misguided and doesn't help us move beyond the current issues of lack of facility of reading in many deaf and hard of hearing children. The standard comparisons group of hearing monolinguals as the gold standard controls for reading may be wrong. Many fluent readers of English don't know these same skills. Past models of hearing readers don't take into account factors that increase perceptual span observed in deaf populations and differences in skipping rates. Perhaps it's time to move beyond the standard psycholinguistics models of reading that have been used for decades. Any thoughts about that comment?
I think that comment is quite complex and difficult to answer in the remaining minute that we have. I think something that's important to emphasize is what Elaine mentioned before, the idea that any language will support your learning to read. But we feel that there are many things that hearing children need to learn that deaf children can also learn. And we feel that though the differences in what hearing children learn and deaf children learn are going to be more about time, instruction, and the specific focus or the specific scaffolds that we need to provide for our deaf and hard of hearing children. What deaf and hard of hearing children are reading is English. So becoming familiar with English will help those children become better readers.
So several people are asking about access to the tools that you have been discussing today, the reading castles for 3 to 5 and K through 3. How can they obtain those tools?
Yeah, so those are available through Sunshine Cottage School for Deaf Children. I think it's sunshinecottage.org, and they have a paper version as well as an e-castles or online version. Again, we don't receive any kind of compensation from its sale. We're just trying to get the word out. So I don't know about the exact cost, as someone was asking, but it's not expensive.
We are at the top of the hour, unfortunately, already. You'll see the emails for our presenters on your screen. So if you have any follow-up questions, I'm sure that they would welcome hearing from you to continue beyond today's presentation. In the chat field, you'll notice, I think it's there, that there is now a link posted for you to be able, is it there, Gunnar?
This is Gunnar. Yeah, I posted it a couple minutes ago.
You'll see a certificate generator there and a short evaluation survey for today's webinar. It will generate a certificate of attendance if you need that. And of course, we always welcome your feedback on our presentations. To our presenters today, thank you so much for all the time and effort it took to prepare and present today's webinar. Thank you to our captioner and to our interpreters, to our background tech support, and of course to all of you who have been present today to think about this really important issue of literacy as a part of the goal that EHDI has at its core, and that is to develop language abilities in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So thank you, everybody, and we wish you happy holidays.